A mafia boss brings a blind woman to his secret meetings, and nobody realizes she's destroying them. To the criminal underworld, Patricia was just a blind prop, a pathetic, harmless accessory the boss brought along. But while these arrogant mobsters openly discussed illegal shipments and dirty politicians, Patricia was secretly typing every single word into a silent braille device hidden in her pocket. She became Paul Sawyer's ultimate weapon, because no one suspects the woman who can't see, until it's far too late.
Let us look closely at Patricia together. You and I are going to step into the shadows of a mind fighting for control. The camera follows her worn shoes, 47 steps from the diner's back door to the first table, 11 more to the coffee station. 4 left, avoiding a cracked tile. This rigid counting is the rhythm of trauma. She memorized the diner to anchor her fragile psyche, but the subway was a different beast entirely, a sensory minefield. The sudden rustle of paper bags, the stinging scent of cheap nail polish, the sharp squeak of a child's shoe on wet linoleum. The city mutated every single night, violently stripping away her fragile boundaries and leaving her exposed to predators in the dark. Let the lens pull back. Exhaustion leaves the human body dangerously vulnerable to manipulation. Patricia stood gripping the cold metal pole, her wooden cane wedged tightly between trembling knees. She anchored herself to the only static truth left. 14 stops until the quiet safety of her empty room. Her nervous system was misfiring, actively shutting out the burning pain in her heels after a brutal double shift. She had just served loud, arrogant men who tossed her a calculated 15% tip to absolve their own guilt. $61. She counted those crumpled bills twice in the dim break room. It is a tragic little ritual of survival, highlighting how desperately we crave predictability when we feel ourselves slowly drowning. We have to examine the cold math of poverty and how it fractures the human spirit. Her electric bill was $78. She only had 61. 12 stops remained when the world violently betrayed her. A sudden, jarring reroute pitched the heavy train car sideways, shattering her fragile pattern in an instant. Her numb fingers slipped from the damp metal, and her cane clattered to the floor. Notice her body language here. A healthy person braces for impact. Patricia chose to fall. Trained by years of quiet rejection, she refused to grab blindly. Creating a scene would only validate the cruel assumptions strangers make in mere seconds. She surrendered completely to gravity, willing to bruise her body just to escape the crushing weight of public pity. But the punishing crack against hard plastic never came. Instead, the camera catches her colliding with an unexpected force. Warmth, the dense, grounding weight of a man's lap, and the liquid friction of high-grade wool against her cheek. She stammered a panicked apology, her mind desperately trying to pull back. But her biology staged a quiet mutiny. Her aching muscles rebelled against her rising fear, instantly recognizing the dark, heavy safety of this foreign structure. Then a hand descended onto her trembling shoulder, not restraining her, but claiming her, placed with the chilling authority of a man who has never once been denied in his life. He uttered one single word, "Don't," a low, vibrating command that bypassed her ears and directly hijacked her soul. The low command vibrated through her very bones. Now, stick with me here because we need to observe the shifting dynamics in this dimly lit car. The air went dead quiet. It is a primitive reaction when an apex predator alters the atmospheric pressure of a room. Patricia could not process the threat. She could not see the violent ink crawling up his throat or the brutal gang affiliations tattooed across his knuckles and beneath his cold eyes. These were symbols that triggered immediate terror in everyone else. She missed the terrified micro-expressions of the man across the aisle, hiding behind his phone. she completely failed to register the nearby couple unconsciously shrinking toward the heavy exit doors. She was entirely blind to the monster holding her. In the language of trauma, this is where the tragic dissonance truly begins. All Patricia registered in that moment was the deceptive gentleness of his heavy hand. Defying 31 years of sharp survival instincts, her exhausted brain simply failed to signal empathy. The physical weight pressing down on her shoulder silently instructed her to stay. Her broken body bypassed all rational defenses. Patricia, a tired waitress with exactly $61 to her name, surrendered her autonomy. She kept her cheek anchored to the expensive dark wool of a dangerous sociopath. For the first time in a decade, she finally closed her eyes and stopped scanning the shadows for danger. This profound, quiet vulnerability is the exact dark soil required for a tragic bond to take root. She believed she had 14 stops of safe harbor ahead of her, completely unaware that he was already silently mapping out the rest of her existence. Let us pan over to Paul Sawyers. He possessed the dark classic profile of a dangerous psychopath. Constantly calculating variables, he remained entirely devoid of basic human sentiment. This was a man who measured his life in lethal percentages and the precise number of seconds it took to break a rival's for spirit. Paul operated strictly within a space of absolute, rigid control. Unconscious women falling on midnight transit systems were never part of his plans. Yet, a strange anomaly occurred tonight. A minor logistical failure with his private driver had unexpectedly forced him down onto the public transit system at 51st Street. Men like Paul Sawyers absolutely despise public spectacles. They do not personally orchestrate. Despite the terrifying mythology whispered about him in the underground, he simply absorbed the inconvenience. He claimed a dark corner seat, wrapped in a bespoke charcoal suit imported from Naples, intending to ruthlessly strategize an extortion contract. Then, the train lurched sideways, injecting chaos into his sterile environment. Someone collapsed directly onto him, entirely ignorant of his lethal status. Her cane hit the dirty floor. She did not scream or protest. Her tired head simply dropped against his thigh, and then she emitted a microscopic, barely audible sound. This utter lack of fear and recognition fundamentally disrupted his dark, unyielding superiority complex. It was a soft sound suspended perfectly between a weary sigh and total surrender. You and I need to look closer here, because this is where his pathology takes a terrifying turn. She went instantly, deeply still. Not medically unconscious, but profoundly asleep. Paul studied her face with the cold, unblinking curiosity of a scientist dissecting a new specimen. He silently cataloged her visible vulnerabilities. The frayed edge of her cheap work collar. The hardened callus on her right palm, forged by years of gripping a cane. He inhaled the tragic breakdown of her environment. Stale coffee and grease, unsuccessfully masked by a cheap floral spray. To a dark predator whose entire life was built on leveraging weakness, her raw exhaustion was a highly exploitable resource. Why did he not push her away? His failure to discard her reveals a twisted, dark proprietary instinct. A heavy passenger 2 seats away, fueled by the aggressive confidence of cheap liquor, noticed Patricia's vulnerability. He leaned in, wearing the predatory smile of a friendly stranger. Paul executed a minimal, highly calibrated response. He simply turned his head. It was a slow, mechanical rotation, radiating the silent, lethal promise of a man who dismantles lives for a living. The intoxicated stranger immediately shrank into a submissive posture, suddenly obsessed with staring at his phone, never daring to make eye contact again. Then a drifting, clueless teenager unconsciously breached their immediate perimeter in the swaying, rattling train car. The teenager was merely riding the chaotic current of a midnight train, but Paul demanded absolute compliance. He slowly lifted a single finger, pointing to a metal handrail 6 feet away. The teenager relocated instantly, obeying an ancient instinct to flee a lethal threat. For 11 consecutive stops, Paul Sawyers projected a suffocating field of terror, maintaining a sterile bubble around the sleeping woman through sheer psychological weight. There was no loud altercation, no sloppy aggression, just the terrifying gravity of a man who understood that true violence is most effective when it is implicitly promised rather than carelessly deployed. Meanwhile, Patricia's destination arrived and vanished, while he quietly memorized her home address. She had tagged her worn cane with an emergency card, the tragic coping mechanism of a vulnerable soul. Yet she remained comatose against him. As the heavy train finally terminated, a weary janitor approached, assessed the lethal stillness radiating from Paul's posture, and wisely chose to vanish into the shadows. Sitting in the harsh, fluorescent isolation, Paul evaluated Patricia with the exact same clinical detachment he used for hostile takeovers. She was neither a strategic liability nor a financial asset. She was a fragile organism that had simply collapsed onto him, entirely devoid of manipulative intent. In his paranoid, transactional existence, every human interaction was a calculated manipulation. To find someone so completely devoid of a hidden agenda was a profound, dangerous trigger. She had constructed no facade. She had merely fallen. Paul calmly withdrew his phone and issued a sterile directive to summon his vehicle. He sat motionless, monitoring her breathing until a black sedan materialized at the dark gate. Come with me here, because this teaches us a hard truth. Our desperate desire for rest often leads us right into the arms of our greatest danger. He did not wake her, ensuring her fragile nervous system remained entirely undisturbed. The heavy watch on his wrist read 1:07 in the morning. She had been unconscious for 41 minutes. He had already decided to steal her away, completely overriding her free will. When Patricia finally drifted back to awareness, the very first thing she felt was a cold, crushing silence. The scene opens in total darkness. Not the damp, suffocating quiet of her rusted apartment on Delancey Street, where the pipes choked and sputtered, and the neighbor's television bled through paper-thin walls. No, this is a heavy, calculated silence, the kind bought with terrifying wealth. As her mind surfaces, her fingers twitch. A former maid, she instantly measures the friction of the sheets binding her. Premium Egyptian cotton. It does not just cover her skin, it swallows her whole, acting as a soft, paralyzing narcotic. She has been completely transplanted into a gilded cage. You and I have probably both learned this painful lesson. The most lethal traps are rarely forged from iron. They are spun from the very comfort we have spent our lives begging for. Let us examine the frame closely, piece by piece. Patricia lies paralyzed on the mattress, her body locked in a brutal trauma response. Stripped of her sight, she maps the unseen room with the precision of a crime scene detective. Her skin reads the perfectly chilled air, breathing in the deep, heavy scent of aged cedar. Beneath her bare heels, the carpet is unnervingly thick. Then the silence breaks. A man's voice drifts from the shadows, smooth and agonizingly slow, dripping with the patience of a true predator. "You took my train?" she whispers into the dark. Her flat tone is a tragic shield, a desperate grab for any illusion of power, in a room where she is utterly powerless. Sometimes, the only armor we have left is the refusal to show our terror. "You took my lap," Paul replies, cutting through the dark. The camera shifts, catching his immediate assertion of power. He rises. His footsteps vanish into the massive acoustics of the room. He stops exactly 8 feet from the bed. It is a terrifyingly calculated distance, close enough to suffocate, far enough to keep her from screaming. The gentle clink of porcelain hits the wood. Suddenly, the warm smell of roasted coffee fills the cold air, a Trojan horse meant to break her defenses. "There is a contract on the table," he says, his voice hollow. And yet she does not move. She starves rather than take his bait. It is a harsh truth we all face. True strength is refusing the bread offered by the hand that holds the knife. "I am blind," she warns him. "I am aware," he answers. And in those 3 words the tragedy is locked into place. He chose her. He outlines his grand, twisted design. 1 full year locked away in this velvet prison. But the true horror lies in the fine dollars. But the true horror lies in the fine print. Even if she falls in love with her captor, the money is hers. When she asks what happens if she walks away, the lighting seems to drop. He casually mentions Mark. He brings up the bruises, the empty bank accounts, the sheer misery waiting for her back home. He paints himself as a dark savior. You and I have seen this manipulation before. The devil never forces you through the door. He simply convinces you that the storm outside is far worse than the fire and ice. Let us watch how the subtle poison of conditioning takes hold. The coffee sits cooling. Her hand drifts toward the cup, finding it perfectly in the dark. A fatal slip, proving her competence, which Paul silently files away for later. The rich taste hits her tongue, a stark reminder that he commands everything here. "I want to go home to Mark," she demands. It breaks the heart, watching someone choose a familiar hell over an unknown heaven. We often run back to the pain we know, simply because we know how to survive it. Paul does not argue. He simply nods. Very well. The sheer lack of resistance hits her like a physical blow. She braced for a fight, a cage snapping shut. Instead, he opens the door wide, a brilliant, terrifying move meant to fracture her reality entirely. She slides her feet into her cheap shoes, rushing out into the blinding noise of the city. The contrast is violent. Car horns scream. The brutal winter wind bites her face. The air tastes thick with gasoline and rot. It is a harsh, chaotic slap after the velvet tomb she just escaped. As she slips into the back seat of his hired car, Paul leans in to set the final hook. "The number is in the right pocket," he murmurs. "When you are ready," he does not say if he says when. That quiet, terrifying confidence is the mark of a man who knows human weakness intimately. The car pulls away, merging into the gray blur of traffic. In the back seat, her trembling fingers slide right into the deep pocket. She is already chained to him, bound by an invisible leash she cannot let go of. The coat wrapped around her shoulders is incredibly heavy, it woven from pure cashmere, a constant reminder of the safety embrace. A constant agonizing blocks. For 7 agonizing blocks, she keeps her hands folded in her lap. She refuses to dig into the pocket. But her mind is already betraying her. She cannot stop comparing the peaceful, smelling cedar of Paul's mansion to the cheap alcohol and screaming fits waiting for her in Mark's apartment. By the 7th Street corner, her willpower snaps. Her hand slips down. Her fingertips brush against the thick, expensive paper of the business card. She does not pull it out, she just holds onto it. We all know what it means to clutch a dangerous lifeline, knowing it will drag us under, but needing it anyway. Follow her as she approaches the rusted door of her reality. You see the deep scars of survival in every move she makes. She ignores the metal lockbox by the frame and digs her key out from under a loose concrete step. The lockbox clicks, you see. That tiny noise is enough to wake the sleeping beast inside. Scraping the key from the dirt buys her 3 precious seconds of silence to breathe. She presses her cheek against the chipped wood, closing her blind eyes to read the room through sound. A loud sports game blares from the television. A glass slams hard against a wobbly wooden table. The tension is thick, awful. It is a profound tragedy. Realizing that a home can be a battlefield where you are constantly bracing for the next explosive mortar shell to drop. She turns the knob, the door winds open, and the heavy, sluggish breathing of her abuser hits her ears. "Where have you been?" Mark barks from the shadows. It is not a question, it is an ambush. The camera lingers on her face as she buries her fear, locking her features into cold stone. She hears the cheap sofa groaning under his weight as he leans forward. "I got stuck on the train," she lies, her voice perfectly flat to avoid setting him off. He spits the excuse right back at her, twisting the words to make her feel small. Then the real motive bleeds out. He demands her money. She whispers that she only made $61 today. The light bill is $78. The math of poverty is a cruel trap, until there is crushing the soul, until there is nothing left to give. The dead silence that follows is thick with malice. He slams his glass down on the table, a violent crack that makes her flinch. It is a warning shot. He groans about his hunger, twisting his own laziness into her failure. When she offers to make him food, he laughs a bitter, hateful laugh. 14 steps to the rusted counter. 7 steps to the stove. She glides through the dark with the tragic grace of a ghost haunting her own life. As she fills a glass of tap water, her sharp senses sweep the room. Suddenly, her breath catches in her throat. Something is wrong. The air feels shifted. We often ignore the quiet alarms sounding in our minds, hoping the danger is not real, but survival demands that we turn and face the shadow in the room. Stick with me here, because this is where her entire world shifts. She stands completely still, dissecting the room layer by layer. She hears the static of the television, the creak of the floorboards for hooing him, and the wet, angry rhythm of Mark's breathing. She smells the greasy, cheap takeout he ate without her, a selfish cruelty she is entirely used to. But underneath the stale grease there is something else, a scent that does not belong here. Slowly, deliberately, she turns. She masks her movements, sliding toward the sofa with the soft, soothing steps of a nurse approaching a wild animal. She reaches out, letting her fingers drift over the torn cushions. The camera pushes in tight on her trembling hand as she brushes against something completely foreign. You and I are going to unpack this heartbreaking moment together. Her fingertips brush against a strange, soft fabric draped over the armrest. Cashmere. Then the scent hits her fully. A sharp, expensive floral perfume, a fragrance far too rich for this crumbling apartment. Another woman was here, in her home, on her couch. The betrayal cuts deep, slicing straight to the bone. Yet, watch her face. The camera finds no tears, no dramatic gasp. She freezes her expression into a pale, lifeless mask. It is the tragic defense of a child who learned early on that crying only brings harder fists. She swallows the absolute agony of a shattered heart whole, burying it deep in her chest so the monster, sitting 3 feet away, will not see her bleed. "I am going to bed," she whispers. Mark says absolutely nothing. The silence is his final cruelty. She moves through the suffocating dark, finding her tiny, uncompromised sliver of the mattress. She lays down, staring up at the black ceiling, refusing to pull the dirty, unwashed blanket over her shivering body. And right there, in the cold, the dam breaks. It is not the cheating that shatters her. It is not the unpaid bills or the threats. It is the absolute, hollow neglect of it all. It is the realization that love should grow you, not grind you down into dust. She has been watering a dead garden for years, clinging to a man who provides nothing but shadows. The choice is no longer between 2 prisons. It is about choosing the one that might just let her out. The camera pushes in slowly. Patricia's trembling fingers slide into the dark wool of her coat, finding the heavy, engraved cardstock. The weight of the paper feels just like Paul. Magnetic, dripping with the terrifying confidence of a man who owns the world. Outside, neon-lit asphalt hisses, with rain, a chaotic hum highlighting the hollow ache of her life. She listens intently. The rhythmic, heavy breathing of Mark beside her confirms he is asleep. Only then does she let her fingertips trace the raised numbers, burning them into her mind. She gives herself 4 days in the shadows. The hardest truth we must learn is that broken people often cling tightly to a familiar cage, simply because the open sky is far too terrifying to face. The scene opens on a tight shot of cheap, wilting carnations. Patricia's slender hands grip the cold ceramic vase, the knuckles turning white under the harsh, fluorescent kitchen light. Mark stands in the doorway, a hollow smile plastered across his face. She can smell the toxic plastic wrappings of the flowers, a bitter stench masking his constant suffocating lies. She does not scream. She simply nods. You and I have to look closely at moments like this to truly understand the anatomy of a broken spirit. Her quiet acceptance is not foolishness, but the agonizing exhaustion of a soul stripped bare. Never make the mistake of confusing a victim's silence with blindness. The deepest tragedy is that they smell the rot long before the garden completely dies. By the third sunset, the walls had closed in completely. The phone line to her sister went dead, a sharp, metallic click echoing in the empty hallway. Desperate, her shaking hand dials Paul. The line connects instantly. No greeting, just the heavy, authoritative breath of a predator waiting in the dark. Minutes later, a black sedan idles at the curb, its driver wrapped in absolute silence. In the dim light of the back seat, Patricia pulls a soft cashmere throw over her trembling shoulders, desperately craving the warmth of the very man who orchestrated her capture. It is a heartbreaking image of human fragility. The most painful lesson we ever face is realizing that a rescuing hand reaching into the dark can so easily lock the door behind us. The camera follows her hesitant steps into the sprawling glass penthouse. Though her eyes are clouded, in permanent darkness, Patricia feels the crushing weight of the room. Paul consumes the space. She catches the dark, resinous scent of rich wood and dangerous intent. You waited 4 days. His voice rumbles, a velvet blade cutting through the engineered silence. The shadows seem to stretch out, swallowing her whole as she sinks into the cold, imported leather of his chair. Far below, the muffled sirens of the city fade to nothing. He has perfectly isolated her. A crucial truth of the world reveals itself in this quiet terror. Real power never needs to raise its voice. It just builds an impossibly beautiful room and quietly locks you inside. A heavy, mechanical click echoes through the vast room as Paul presses play on a silver recorder. He commands her to listen, and the silence shatters. Within 3 agonizing seconds, Patricia's breath catches in her throat. The tinny recorded voice belongs to Mark. He is speaking to a lawyer, his tone entirely flat, entirely dead. The camera lingers on a single tear sliding down her pale cheek as she realizes her entire marriage was a beautifully constructed coffin. This was not sudden anger, but a slow, venomous execution. We are forced to look at a terrifying reflection of humanity here. The true monsters do not lurk in the woods waiting for midnight. They sit across from us at the breakfast table, smiling as they drink their morning coffee. The recording grinds on. By the 7th minute, Mark uses the words cognitive decline. By the 9th, power of attorney. He is calmly building a cage of legal paperwork to bury her alive. Through the camera lens, you and I watch Patricia freeze. She does not sob. She does not collapse. She sits with a terrifying, marble stillness, her unseeing eyes fixed straight ahead. It is the tragic defense of a wounded animal pretending to be dead so the predator will walk away. Every word on that tape is another brick sealing her tomb, yet her face remains an absolute mask of stone. It is a harsh reminder for all of us. The most fatal wounds a person can suffer will never spill a drop of blood. Instead, they completely freeze your soul from the inside out. With a harsh snap, the tape finishes. The silence that follows is thick enough to choke on. Patricia's fragile posture shatters, her shoulders collapsing under the weight of a decade of lies. The entire foundation of her life turns to ash in an instant. The camera shifts to Paul. He remains draped in shadows by the floor to siling against the glass. Watching the rain beat against the glass, he does not rush to comfort her. He simply lets a heavy, leather-bound document slide onto the glass table. It is a masterful stroke of dark psychology, offering a life raft to a drowning woman. This quiet tragedy teaches us something profoundly uncomfortable. The deepest bonds of trust are rarely planted in the sunlight. They are grown in the smoking ruins of a broken heart. The shot frames her delicate fingers, brushing the cold glass table until they touch the thick, cold barrel of a Mont Blanc pen. It feels like pure gravity in her hand. With a hollow chest, she drags the nib across the heavy paper, signing away her freedom in 2 clean, desperate strokes. Patricia steps off the cliff into the dark. "Day 1, Paul murmurs, his voice a low tremor that seems to vibrate through the floorboards. She is trapped again, but the sterile chill of this high-rise feels safer than the warm house she left behind, safer than the warm house she left behind. It is the ultimate quiet tragedy of human survival. When your spirit has been crushed into dust, merely understanding the exact shape of your new prison can forgiving, you are crushed into believing you are finally safe. The screen fades in and out, showing the agonizing passage of 3 days. Patricia moves like a ghost through the penthouse. Barefoot, she counts every single step, her hands trailing lightly against the plaster walls. She learns the sharp, acoustic echo of the marble kitchen, the way the morning sun warms the rug by the east window, and the menacing, heavy creak of the study door. Most of all, she learns the terrifying electric charge in the air when Paul walks into a room. She is rewiring her broken soul to survive the rhythm of a new predator. There is a terrifying beauty in watching a human's own ruin. We have an astonishing ability to survive pitch-black darkness, just as long as we can memorize exactly where the walls are hiding. The camera glides through a massive, dimly lit closet. Patricia runs her pale hands over rows of garments, soft cashmere, freezing silk, stiff leather. As she touches each piece, a chilling realization washes over her face. Everything is her exact size. He had been watching her, measuring her life long before she ever knew his name. She swallows the rising panic, letting the dark romance of her captivity wash over her. She simply folds herself into his world, fading into the shadows of the penthouse like a phantom. She chooses to become invisible. It is a painful reality we must accept about the deepest forms of control. Real manipulation never arrives as a violent shove. It arrives as a warm, your freezing shoulder, gently draped over your freezing shoulders. 2 months vanish. The camera frames a heavy oak door, swinging open into a private windowless conference room. Paul guides her inside, offering no comfort, only the demand for absolute obedience. Patricia, dressed flawlessly in a dove-gray blazer, listens. She counts the heavy scrape of wooden chairs, 8 men. The air is thick with expensive cologne, stale breath, and the intoxicating stench of dirty money. Stick with me here, because this is where she turns her weakness into armor. She simply pours a glass of ice water and vanishes into her own stillness, becoming nothing more than a shadow in the corner. It is a brutal law of survival. When you are thrown into a pit of starving wolves, the smartest move is to let them forget you know how to bite. The camera slowly pans across the faces of the syndicate men. They glance at her unseeing eyes and instantly write her off as a broken doll. To them, a blind woman is just another piece of expensive furniture decorating Paul's empire. Patricia absorbs their quiet contempt without a flinch. She lets the insult pass through her, focusing instead on the raspy, arrogant voice of a man named Doyle. He laughs as he openly brags about smuggling shipments out of Newark. Another voice casually drops the name of a bought-and-paid-for politician. They speak freely, utterly blinded by their own pride. This is the tragic flaw that ruins empires. Pure arrogance is a blinding fog. Give a man enough pride, and he will gladly hand you the very knife to cut his throat. Look closely at the framing of this scene. The men lean over the heavy table, totally consumed by their own greed, completely ignoring the tragic, beautiful woman sitting just inches away. They assume she is just an empty vessel, a damaged pet kept for Paul's dark amusement. But the camera slowly tilts down to her coat pocket. Hidden deep in the dark wool, her thumb furiously dances over a silent Braille note-taker. Click, click, click. She is recording every betrayal, every shipping route, every weakness. 30 years of darkness taught her how to be perfectly still while her mind burned like wildfire. This is the art of the ghost. True power lies in total invisibility. The smaller they think you are, the easier it is to memorize exactly where to strike. The seasons bleed into one another. Over 4 agonizing meetings, she builds an entire map of their criminal underworld inside her head. She tracks the blood money, the whispered names, the hidden daggers. Paul never asks her to do this. He simply watches her from the shadows, waiting to see if his tragic bird will learn to fly. One rainy evening, Patricia steps quietly into the doorway of his dim study. Doyle is moving more than timber through Newark. Her voice cuts softly through the dark. Across the room, the scratching of Paul's heavy pen instantly stops. He already knew, but she has just proven she is a weapon. Here is the final truth. Do not sit quietly waiting for the world to notice your value. Gather your fire in the dark and strike when it burns the brightest. Let us open the file on Paul Sawyers and his captive Patricia. You and I are going to unpack this dark psychological dance together. Picture the scene, dim light, cutting across a mahogany desk. Notice how she kept her voice, entirely stripped of emotion. Third chair, left side, herringbone jacket. The dead silence from Paul was not just a pause. It was the terrifying mental recalibration of a kingpin updating his grip on reality. "Sit down, Patricia," he ordered. She found the leather chair, feeling its cold, unyielding texture. From the beginning, he demanded, craving total submission. "Tell me everything." She folded her hands, offering a classic surrender, and began. "Here is a simple truth. True chaos, much like systemic trauma, always starts with a heavy, deafening absence. The cinematic frame reveals the classic, suffocating markers of impending violence. Meetings cut short, whispered phone calls echoing down the hall. A heavy, atmospheric suppression settles when a room knows a threat exists, but the narcissist forbids them from speaking its name. Patricia felt these shifts in her bones. She sensed the very air pressure drop when Paul carried the weight of a crisis. She never dared to ask questions, because sometimes in life, curiosity does not just kill. It invites destruction. She simply waited in the shadows. On a Tuesday, during the 4th month, he returned at 2 a.m. She listened to his footsteps in the pitch black. It was the slow, agonizing pacing of a dying apex predator, desperately conserving whatever strength he had left. The heavy wood of the liquor cabinet creaked shut, leaving the terrifying stillness of a volatile man standing alone in the dark. The camera finds Patricia in the doorway. Wrapped in a navy silk robe, a beautiful gift that served as a chain, she offered him coffee. He muttered that she should be asleep, but she smoothly deflected. Moving to the kitchen, she poured 2 cups without asking. Trauma binds people in tragic ways, forcing the broken to anticipate their captor's every breath. The painful lesson here is that even the most brutal monsters secretly crave warmth, yet remain completely incapable of asking for it. She quietly placed the steaming cups on the low table, retreating to her designated shadow at the far edge of the velvet sofa. Moments later, the soft rustle of expensive fabric confirmed he had crossed the room. He did not retreat to the opposite end of the velvet sofa. Instead, he sat remarkably close. She felt the heavy kinetic shift of his body weight, his radiating heat washing over her skin before he even settled. Through a director's lens, this tiny spatial shift is monumental. Over the preceding weeks, the texture of their silence had shifted. It began as the hostile quiet of a hostage standoff, then bled into a numb coexistence. But now, the silence held a strange, localized gravity. It teaches us that the walls we build to keep the world out will eventually trap us inside. The kingpin had dropped his defensive perimeter, allowing her to breathe within the immediate radius of his strike zone. "How many people know you are worried?" she asked, her voice cutting through the dark. When he whispered that no one knew, she instantly realized he had been hiding his mental collapse for months. He offered no angry rebuttal. Instead, his trembling fingers turned his silver cup. The camera focuses on the sharp click of crystal striking his expensive watch. Every inch of Paul Sawyer's was a masterclass in deception. His tailored suits, his rigid spine, the total suppression of his soul. His persona was built to shatter enemies. But life often reminds us that a perfect mask is the heaviest burden a person can carry. Patricia saw right through the terror. She only saw the fractured, bleeding boy sitting Sue in alone at 2 in the morning, holding on to a coffee cup like a lifeline. "There is a faction encroaching on the port corridor," he confessed. His voice lacked its usual iron grip. This was raw fear, bleeding through the cracks of his crumbling empire. He laid bare the ultimate paranoia of the kingpin, the exhausting reality of being hunted by your own men. This is where the dynamic truly flips. Patricia saw his profound isolation. A tragic truth of life is that true loneliness is not being by yourself. It is being surrounded by people waiting for you to fall. Outside, a siren wailed and faded into the rain. He weakly denied her pity, but the lie was entirely hollow. She unhurriedly lowered her delicate cup to the table, her slow movements stripped of all performative tension, perfectly matching his quiet emotional surrender. Over 4 grueling months, a twisted psychological root system had grown between them. It was built in the shadows, forged through quiet morning rituals, and the tragic vulnerability of a monster who finally closed his eyes. This is the dark romance of Stockholm Syndrome, where the captive slowly morphs into the captor's only sanctuary. "You do not have to be alone in it right now," she whispered. He stayed perfectly still for a long time. Then, the camera catches the exact second his armor shatters. The heavy leather cushion sighed as his rigid spine slumped. He didn't need to speak. Life teaches us that sometimes we seek salvation in the exact hands that broke us. His breathing slowed down completely, marking the absolute, irreversible collapse of his psychological defenses. "I want you to really think about the psychology playing out in this room. You and I have probably both felt the crushing weight of a burden we could not share." The sound of his breath was the raw auditory signature of a broken man letting go. They sat high in a glass tower and entirely insulated from the bleeding city below. Paul, a ruthless tyrant who wielded fear like a blade, now sat completely defenseless beside a woman who could not even see his face. The beautiful, tragic lesson here is that stripping away our power is often the only way to rediscover our humanity. Patricia listened to his chest. Rise and fall. This was no sudden miracle. It was the inevitable fruit of their trauma bond, the most painfully real moment either of them had touched in years. She kept these thoughts buried deep within the dark theater of her mind. The coffee slowly grew cold on the table, and neither of them dared to break the stillness. But peace is a fleeting illusion in the underworld. She felt the violent shift in the atmosphere long before his armed guards died. This was not some mystical gift of the blind, a cheap, patronizing trope she absolutely hated. It was pure survival instinct, is that the painful scars of our past often become the exact tools that keep us alive tomorrow. At 11:43 p.m., sitting in the quiet study, her mind was a radar sweeping the dark. The danger was already inside the walls, and it was not coming through the grand elevator doors. The nightmare had finally arrived. A low, grinding vibration echoed from the utility shaft, exactly 2 floors beneath their golden cage. To survive, she had memorized every single mechanical heartbeat of this building. This specific elevator car groaned with a heavier, delayed tension in its steel cables. She had cataloged this detail on day 1. It is a striking lesson in human nature. Arrogance constantly blinds the powerful to the tiny details that matter most. She slowly rose from her velvet chair. Exactly 4 seconds later, the entire power grid died. The sudden pitch-black darkness crashed down like a physical blow on the guards. Down the hall, she could hear Briggs, a mountain of a man, screaming useless orders into a radio that the hit squad had already jammed to static. Heavy combat boots slammed against the hardwood as a second guard bolted down the corridor. His frantic stumbling painted a clear picture. He was trying to navigate by memory, and raw terror was tearing his mind apart. The sickening crash of priceless Murano glass confirmed he was completely lost in the dark. Then came the deafening blast of the breach. It didn't hit the reinforced front doors, but the hidden service entry near the kitchen. This meant the killers had been inside the walls long before the lights went out. Long before the lights went out, the power cut was their green light. A vital life lesson is that in moments of total chaos, panic is the fastest route to the grave. Patricia fought back her desperate urge to run, turning slowly to count her exact steps into the terrifying abyss. Let us look at this terrifying sequence together, piece by piece. 12 calm, measured strides from the study to the edge of the sitting room. She turned left for 4 steps, smoothly gliding past the heavy oak trunk. 8 perfect paces to the fireplace, her fingertips finding the cold marble mantle right where it belonged. It teaches us a profound truth. When the world goes dark, the only map that matters is the one you painstakingly built in your mind. The room was drowning in chaos. Through the screaming, she tracked the heavy, methodical footsteps of 4 distinct killers. They moved with the cold, silent purpose of true predators, while Paul's highly trained guards thrashed blindly in the shadows, dying like frightened prey in their own home. Picture the scene with me, if you will. The lighting is fractured, chaos bleeding through the edges of the frame. Amidst the sheer panic, Patricia hears it, a heavy, sickening thud of impact. Paul, the untouchable titan, lets out a low, guttural gasp, his commanding presence suddenly shattered by pure physical agony. The great megalomaniac has finally fallen. But Patricia does not weep. She cannot afford the luxury of human emotion. That is a ghost reserved for the quiet hours of the aftermath. Operating on cold, tragic reflex, her trembling fingers sweep across the cold marble of the fireplace, 1, 2, 3 deeply carved panels until she finds the 4th. Flush invisible to the naked eye, she presses the lower left corner, and the heavy stone groans open. The tragedy of survival is that it strips us of our humanity just to keep us breathing. The heavy stone shifts inward exactly 6 inches, swallowing the ambient light. Patricia finds Paul entirely in the pitch black. She hears the tragic, labored drag of his boots, the undeniable rhythm of a broken man pretending he is not bleeding. Hostile footsteps echo closer. Yet Patricia's single anchoring syllable, she speaks a single anchoring syllable, summoning the very monster who caged her. His trembling hand blindly finds the frame. She pulls him into the dark, her fingers instantly coated in the hot, wet slick of his ruined flesh. She offers no tears as the vault door seals them inside a 3-foot concrete coffin. The camera lingers on the absolute blackness. True trauma, you see, rarely bothers to scream. Most of the time, it just waits patiently in the dark. The bunker presses against them like a physical weight. Pressed chest to chest, Patricia's the frantic spike of Paul's breathing as he desperately tries to swallow his own agony. Just beyond the cold steel, invaders are tearing his empire apart. Heavy glass shatters in a primal display of dominance. Yet inside this breathless void, the true tragedy unfolds. Patricia does not weep. She does not beg her captor for safety. Her nervous system has beautifully, terribly adapted to his violence. She stands perfectly still in the dark. Paul can feel her total lack of fear, and it terrifies him. She has completely normalized the nightmare he forced upon her. The saddest reality of the human heart is how quickly it can learn to turn a violent cage into a comfortable home. Paul exhales his question into the stifling air like a dying ghost. How did she know about the room? Patricia answers with devastating flatness, whispering that she knows where everything is. Violent shouts bleed through the walls, but the real tectonic shift is happening right here. Paul Sawyers, the untouchable architect of her misery, has finally met his own fragile mortality. He is bleeding out, stripped of his godlike grandiosity. The ultimate indignity is that he now relies entirely on the woman he thought he owned. She keeps her hand pressed to his ruined arm, tracking his pulse like a living monitor. Time passes only in the frantic rise and fall of his bleeding chest. When everything is violently taken from you, survival becomes a quiet obsession with the few fragile things you can still measure. Stick with me here, because this is where the power dynamic truly shatters. Paul is gasping, his breath shallow and panicked. The deep wound above his elbow soaks Patricia's palm in thick, heavy warmth. In the absolute dark, she performs a silent triage. The blood is not pulsing. He is going to live. But she deliberately keeps this truth to herself. She knows a shattered man cannot listen to reason while bleeding in the dark. Just inches away, his glorious empire is being reduced to ashes. The soundscape of the invasion mutates. The chaotic smashing fades into the cold, disciplined thud of tactical boots, reclaiming the floorboards. The panic is receding. The beautiful truth of any nightmare is that our fear always broadcasts a much louder echo than the reality of the threat itself. The camera pushes in on her face, pale but terrifyingly calm. She calculates the footfalls above. 4, maybe 5 men. The initial shock of the ambush has faded, replaced entirely by cold muscle memory. She tracks the violent choreography through the deep, rhythmic vibrations rattling directly against her spine. Her mind wanders to the expensive Venetian plaster behind her head, applied in 7 obsessive layers. It was the ultimate monument to Paul's desperate need to control everything he touched. Now, that beautifully tragic monument is physically shuddering under the boots of armed men. It is a heartbreaking reminder that no matter how much wealth we use to build our sanctuaries, it only takes a single spark to turn them back into primitive, violent hunting grounds. In the suffocating darkness, the wounded apex predator finally stirs. Paul attempts to shift his heavy frame, but Patricia's fingers immediately dig into his bicep like iron claws. She hisses a single, commanding word. Amazingly, the great tyrant freezes, but out of a tragic realization, Our tragic realization. The woman he broke is now the only one who can see in the dark. They are trapped in a concrete box barely wider than a coffin. Yet the invisible crown has quietly passed from his head to hers. Months ago, trapped in her lonely isolation, she had memorized every survival tool on these shelves, using only her trembling fingertips. She had been preparing for a war he arrogantly ignored. Real power is never freely given away. It is patiently stolen in the dark. The camera acts as her mind's eye, mapping the pitch-black shelves. A medical kit on the second tier. 2 heavy flashlights she refuses to touch, knowing a sliver of light beneath the steel door invites certain death. In this breathless intimacy, she studies the ruined titan beside her. Paul has always been a creature of pure, kinetic violence. Over 7 agonizing months of captivity, she has memorized his every cruel micro-expression. Right now, his absolute stillness is terrifying. He feels like a live bomb locked inside a velvet box, desperate for a single spark. Yet fighting every toxic instinct he possesses, he finally surrenders the reins to her. It is a devastatingly poetic shift. True survival often demands that we completely burn down the stubborn pride that usually keeps us standing. You and I have witnessed this exact tragic reversal before. Patricia absorbs his quiet surrender without an ounce of joy. There is no triumph in becoming the master of your own hell. Beyond the heavy steel, a sharp voice slices through the dust. The massive front doors groan open and slam shut. The hostile boots slowly retreat. Soon, the steady rumble of Briggs' voice echoes, confirming the perimeter is secure. The bloody chaos has evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the mere bolsters of survival. Patricia's muscle memory flawlessly takes over. Reaching blindly, her fingers hook the cold latches of the medical case. She presses it to her hip to muffle the sharp snap. In the heavy wake of tragedy, absolute discipline is the only thing that keeps the human heart quietly beating. She demands his wounded arm with the cold authority of a surgeon. Paul obeys instantly. There is no fragile ego, no bitter defiance from the fallen king. He surrenders his bleeding flesh to the dark. Patricia grasps his arm, tracing the warm, torn muscle with heartbreaking detachment. This is the numb precision of a woman who accepted long ago that nobody was coming to save her. The wound is brutal, but it will not claim his life tonight. She wraps the bandages with a mechanical focus, perfectly separating the monster from his injury. Yet the sheer weight of his presence is maddening. She feels the feverish heat radiating off his skin. His invisible, predatory stare presses heavily against her face. To gently heal the very hand that strikes you is perhaps the most profound of human tragedies. Let's examine this devastating exchange together, you and I. Paul whispers into the dark, marveling at how she found him in the chaos. His voice has lost its theatrical poison. Patricia tightens the bandage and delivers a chilling truth. Because she has been quietly studying him, she outlines his predictable arrogance, always left of center, hovering near an escape, projecting absolute dominance. The tragic silence that follows is the sound of a god, realizing he is entirely mortal. He finally chokes on his failure, admitting he swore he would protect her. Patricia agrees, without shedding a single tear. If you wish to outlive a terrible predator, you must patiently study its shadow until you master the darkness itself. Patricia's cold confirmation hangs bitterly in the air. Suddenly, 3 rhythmic knocks strike the heavy steel. It is Briggs. Patricia steps back, gracefully allowing the broken king to reclaim a fraction of his ruined pride. Paul pushes the hatch open and sickly amber light bleeds into their dark tomb. The camera follows Paul as he steps into the wreckage of his immaculate life. He stares blankly at the breathtaking desecration. Countless pieces of shattered Italian glass, his flawless, Untouchable empire, utterly humiliated and destroyed in 12 minutes. The tragedy of a man obsessed with power is beautifully simple. It only takes one brutal moment of violent chaos to remind us that total control over our fate is always a fragile, deeply temporary illusion. He stands paralyzed in the suffocating silence. When he finally turns to face her, the tension in the room is heavy enough to touch. His long-held grip of emotional containment has violently shattered. She feels the burning weight of his gaze, yet refuses to offer the mercy of a confession. Speaking the truth of their bond too early might break its fragile architecture. Instead, she steps out of the shadows and into the amber glow of his ruined empire. Her trembling hand traces the battered drywall until she finds her cane. She plants herself firmly beside her captor amid the broken glass, offering nothing but her quiet presence. Sometimes, shared pain forges a chain far more lethal than hatred. Standing in the graveyard of his own making, he breathes a single word, "Patricia." You and I are going to look at this tragedy together, because it perfectly shows the quiet trap of a trauma bond. He spoke her name with that terrifyingly flat tone, typical of a master manipulator. Patricia simply turned toward the sound. Day 366 arrived the way profound shifts usually do, without warning. For a year, she tracked the shifting morning shadows and the pacing of the Venetian craftsman, driven by the obsessive vigilance of a captive. Her body absorbed every inch of this beautiful prison. It happens when a victim stops fighting the cold walls, stops looking for an escape, and learns to speak the twisted language of their cage fluently. The lesson here is simple but devastating. Survival sometimes tricks us into loving the exact thing that is destroying us. She sat perfectly still when Paul walked in at 9 in the morning. His movements were frighteningly deliberate, projecting the chilling calm of a man who believes he dictates reality itself. He sat across the heavy table and placed an object down. Patricia did not reach for it. Her conditioned passivity held her entirely frozen. "The year is fulfilled," he announced softly. "The threat is neutralized. Doyle's arrangement has been dismantled." He detailed how the Port family reached terms in September. When he reminded her she was present for 2 of those coercive conversations, she quietly agreed. An account was now funded with $5 million. It was a tragic display of total psychological control, dressed up beautifully as a simple, everyday business deal. "The transfer clears today," Paul stated, letting a heavy, calculated pause hang in the air. He pushed the contract forward, telling Patricia she was finally free to walk away. Outside, the indifferent November morning rolled on. You could hear the distant percussion of construction crews and blaring cabs, completely blind to the profound emotional capture happening inside this glass tower. Slowly, Patricia reached out. Her fingers found the thick paper, tracing the worn fold lines born from a full year of anxious consultation. She mapped the surface completely and methodically. This is a crucial detail. She was grounding herself in tactile reality, desperate for an anchor when confronted with the terrifying prospect of sudden freedom after so many months of deep psychological subjugation. At the bottom lay her signature, identical to the mark she made that first morning while the trauma of recorded audio still ravaged her nervous system. Holding the document, Patricia's mind regressed back to Delancey Street. She remembered the wobble-legged table and the $61 crumpled in her apron. That former life had been systematically hollowed out by Paul, a man who coldly weaponized her blindness as a tactical vulnerability. She remembered waking up that first night in his rebuilt apartment, wrapped in expensive sheets and an engineered silence that carried a heavy, invisible price. She thought of the memorized shipping contacts and the terrifying sound of Doyle's breathing, meticulously documented in her braille shorthand as a desperate tool for sheer survival. Patricia remembered the claustrophobic 3-foot panic room and how Paul had extended his arm to her in the dark without any resistance. She fixated on the amber-lit quality of his voice when he said her name. We can clearly see the deep roots of severe Stockholm Syndrome taking hold here. Much like the tragic tale of Luca and the infamous kingpin Vittorio, Patricia interpreted her captor's predatory focus as genuine affection. She believed she was finally being seen rather than simply watched. Society had always monitored her with a gaze of pity reserved for the fragile. But Paul's dark attention felt different. She tragically mistook the weight of shared mornings and cold coffee for true intimacy, failing entirely to recognize the manipulative architecture of a master captor at work. Watch how Paul framed his control. He stocked her closet with garments organized by occasion, presenting his absolute domination over her space as a caring form of logic. He would sit quietly in the dark at 2 a.m, displaying a calculated vulnerability. He knew exactly what she was capable of, because a predator always studies their prey. Yet, in the quiet of that glass tower, Patricia rationalized his manipulation. She reached the tragic conclusion that after 31 years of being completely looked past, she had spent 8 months being truly known. The devastating reality of a trauma bond is that the captive cannot return from this distorted perception. She was completely unwilling to trade this toxic validation for $5 million and a lonely freedom. In a gesture of ultimate surrender, masked as personal empowerment, Patricia tore the contract in half. The sound was crisp and final. The thick paper resisted for a moment before yielding completely, a perfect metaphor for her shattered defenses. She placed the torn halves on the table, folding her hands with a chilling compliance. The room fell dead silent. "Patricia," Paul whispered, using that hollow, late-night voice. "I am aware of what I am doing," she countered, demanding it be noted on the record. She insisted she wasn't staying out of desperation, proudly declaring she had $5, but held more morning she had Warner Straught about his criminal operation than anyone in the city. She kept her voice perfectly level, clinically detached from the absolute tragedy of her total subjugation. "I am staying because this is the only room where the lights being on or off does not change what anyone sees," she told him. This rationalization highlights a deeply painful truth. Victims often sacrifice freedom to secure the illusion of acceptance. Paul exhaled with the dark satisfaction of a conqueror. His heavy hand reached across the table, covering both of hers. It was the exact same hand that forcefully pressed her down on a midnight train, operating under the guise of keeping her safe. He held her hands in silence, knowing his physical dominance spoke louder than words. Here is the tragic lesson you and I must remember. True safety empowers you to confidently walk out the front door. It never conditions you to willingly lock yourself inside your own cage. Slowly, she turned her hands over, returning his grip and sealing their trauma bond. High above the distances separating healthy individuals, Patricia sat entrenched in the engineered isolation of the glass tower. She felt a quiet, devastating certainty moving through her, the delusion that she was exactly where she decided to be. She convinced herself she had not fallen into a predator's snare, but actively chosen this captivity. The torn contract remained on the table like a discarded lifeline, and neither made a move to clear it away. This is the ultimate victory of a megalomaniacal narcissist. They rewrite a victim's reality so thoroughly that the captive fiercely defends their invisible chains, fully believing they forged the iron locks themselves, a flawless, tragic capture.